Hello, and welcome back to Wendy's Weird World. Or if you're new here, welcome for the first time, and I hope you come back. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to my story. Today's tale is The Puppy from Appalachia. Trigger warnings for this story include mild violence. If that type of thing bothers you, you can click off now. But for those staying, let's get on with the story. The Puppy from Appalachia. I live in the upstate of South Carolina. If you've ever visited South Carolina, then you know there are a lot of forest and farmland outside of the cities, and the cities are pretty spread out from one another. Basically, if you want to live out in the country, this is a great place to call home. I don't live in a city, and the town I grew up in back in the 80s didn't even have like 3,000 people living in it. So most people in town knew each other like the typical small town community. As you guessed, I'm part of Generation X, so I grew up mostly in the 80s. Back then, we would play outside a lot, and having a pet was like having an extra friend to go adventuring with, especially if we wanted to adventure in the woods. This all happened when I was 10 years old. I have an older sister, so she was 14 at the time and was getting into teenage things, while I was happily playing pretend with my Barbie dolls inside or just outside goofing around. We had recently lost our dog, and he was what looked like maybe a yellow lab or a golden retriever mix, because he was a big boy and he was a lot of fun to go adventure with, and my parents knew he was big enough to protect us. It was sad, but growing up in the country, you just learn early that death is a part of life and you just love while you can. It was summer, and one of the best parts about summer was going on vacation. I wasn't born in South Carolina, so in the summer we would go visit family in Delaware and Virginia. Rocky Mount, Virginia is where my grandma Kate lived, and she lived with her mother, my great-grandma Hodges, and next to them was more family. What I didn't know at the time is that it's in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, as was our home in South Carolina. While both are technically in Appalachia, it's on the outskirts, so none of us grew up learning the rules of Appalachia. At Grandma's house, beyond the backyard, that's where the forest began. I was outside playing cartoon freeze tag with my cousin, who's the same age as me and lived next door. If you don't know what cartoon freeze tag is, it's a version of tag where you're frozen if you get tagged until you say the name of a cartoon character and no repeats are allowed. I remember I yelled out, "Speedy Gonzales," and that's when I heard it. I immediately held my hands up in a T formation, calling a timeout from the game, and I started walking toward the forest, still out of breath from running around. I held my breath a little to listen, and it was definitely something whining. As I got closer to the tree line, I saw a little bit of movement in the shade, but I couldn't tell what it was. The whining was getting more clear, and it sounded like a puppy. When I got to the edge of the woods, I could see the puppy. He was gray and black and looked kind of like maybe he was a German Shepherd mix. I looked around to see if his mom was around, because I definitely didn't want a German Shepherd angry with me. By this time, my cousin was right behind me. No other animals or people were around, and the puppy just kept whining, so, me being me, I picked him up and did my best to comfort him. He gave me a sniff, then gave my finger a lick, and stopped whining. "Let's take him in, maybe I can keep him," I said to my cousin, and started walking fast back to my grandma's house. I couldn't wait to show them the pup. Once inside, I started showing him to my parents, and I asked if I could keep him. The expression on my dad's face was absolutely not, which was what I expected. Mom was an animal lover like me, so she knew how much I missed her old dog and how much my sister and I used to play with him. My sister was not so much of a teenager that she was too cool to hold the puppy and play with it too. Mom looked at Dad and said, "We'll talk about it. But first, I want you to show me where you found him. His mom might be looking for him." I explained that that's what I thought at first too, but my cousin and I took my mom out to where we found the puppy, just inside the woods. Way out here? She asked. Yeah, he was crying, and I imitated the puppy's whine. We knew that beyond our family's property, it was miles before there was a neighbor's yard. These woods grew through a huge ravine and covered at least 10 square miles. Okay, let's go back inside. I think Grandma made a coconut cake, Mom told me. Chubby then and chubby now, I picked up the pace and quickly went inside. I later found out Mom had told me about the cake to hurry me along because she had an eerie feeling of being watched out there. Grandma, God love her, because if she thought it, she said it. She told me, "That's one ugly puppy. I don't know why you'd want to keep it." She told my dad where the shelter was, and since we were leaving the next day, we could just drop it by on the way home. Even if she thought it was ugly, Grandma still made the puppy a nice dinner, and she set him up in the closed-in porch at the back of the house so that if he made a mess, it was easy to clean up. She also made sure he had a nice soft bed to sleep on. Grandma made quilts, so she took a pillowcase and stuffed it with quilt batting, and then loosely stitched it closed for a makeshift bed. I didn't know at the time, but we'd end up taking the makeshift bed with us because Mom ended up talking Dad into letting me keep the puppy before they went to bed. We got up early the next day so we could get ready to leave just after lunch. We wanted to make sure we had plenty of time to make sure everything was packed and we hadn't forgotten anything and had plenty of time to load the car. And then we would just spend the last few hours enjoying our time with family before we left. As always, the visit was over far too soon, and Grandma and Great-Grandma loaded us down with lots of yummy home-baked snacks, fresh fruit, and crackers. I gave them all hugs and kisses goodbye with the puppy cradled in my arms. Grandma, in her honest way, said again, "Phew, boy, that's one ugly puppy. Why do you want to keep it anyway?" "Aw, it's cute and it needs me," I defended the little pup. She smiled and gave me and the pup a pat on the head and made sure I had the little bed that she'd made for him at the pillowcase. "In case you get tired of holding him," she said. I grinned up at her. "Thanks, Grandma," and we were on our way back home. While I was playing with the puppy, I noticed he had beautiful golden eyes and interesting-looking paws. His back paws looked like I would expect a dog's paws to look. But his front paws, the toes looked a little longer, like a combination of hands and feet. They were similar to the front paws on a raccoon. "So what are you going to name him?" Mom asked me. "I think I'll call him Paws because his front paws look funny." "Look funny how?" Mom asked. So I leaned forward and held the puppy up so she could see his front paws. "See, his front paws are different from his back paws." Mom nodded. "Probably a birth defect. That might be why he was abandoned." "Paws it is." Paws quickly became my constant companion. We spent our days exploring the woods behind our house, playing in the creek, and of course, picking wild blackberries. Surprisingly, he would eat a few off the vine as I picked them. He was a curious pup, always sniffing around and discovering new things. Despite his odd appearance, Paws was the best friend I could have asked for. His loyalty and playful nature made every day an adventure. As the weeks passed, Paws grew rapidly. By the end of summer, he was almost unrecognizable from the small puppy I had found. His coat had turned a deep gray-black, and he was much larger than any dog I'd ever seen. His golden eyes, however, remained the same, warm and trusting. One evening, after a day of blackberry picking, my dad sat me down for a talk. "Wendy, some of the neighbors have been reporting livestock losses," he said. His brow furrowed. Sheep, chickens, even a calf was found dead in strange ways. I hugged Paws closer to me, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "You don't think Paws did it, do you?" Dad sighed. "I don't want to believe it, sweetheart. but he's grown so big and he looks more like a wolf than a dog now. We just have to be sure. I promised to keep a closer eye on Paws, though in my heart I knew he wasn't the culprit. He was respectful of the neighbors, and if he went roaming off at night, he preferred the woods. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft whimper from Paws. He seemed restless, pacing around the backyard, occasionally standing up on his hind legs, which was a trick that I taught him, but one he seemed to do more naturally than any dog should. The mysterious loss of livestock continued, and the tension in my home grew. My parents were wary, but I defended Paws fiercely. He was my best friend, and I knew he wasn't capable of anything. One night, as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a low growl from the backyard. I peeked out the window and I saw Paws standing upright, staring into the dark woods. His ears were perked, and his muscles were tensed as if he sensed something. I slipped out of my bed and was careful not to wake my parents. I opened the back door and Paws immediately turned to me, his eyes pleading. He nudged my hand and then looked back toward the woods. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, following him to the edge of the forest. That's when I saw them, shadows moving silently between the trees. Large wolf-like creatures, but walking on two legs, just like Paws enjoyed doing. My heart pounded in my chest. Those were no ordinary wolves. They were something else, something much more dangerous. The next morning, I told my parents what I had seen in spite of the risk of getting in trouble. They were skeptical, but they agreed to keep Paws inside at night just in case. Despite their precautions, the killings escalated, and the neighbors began whispering about a wolf pack descending from the mountains, and not a peep was said about Paws being the guilty party anymore. That evening, just as the sun was setting, Paws began to growl again. This time it was louder and more urgent. He led me to the back door and pawed to be let out. I followed him outside, and there, at the edge of our yard, stood the creatures I had seen before. They were massive, with golden eyes that were luminous even in the dim light. One of them stepped forward, baring its teeth with a low growl. Paws immediately stood in front of me, his body tense and ready to protect. He growled back a deep, resonant sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. The creature snarled and lunged, but Paws met him head-on, wrestling him to the ground. My parents rushed outside, and my dad grabbed his rifle. "Stay back, Wendy," he shouted, aiming at the creatures, but Paws already had the situation under control. He fought fiercely, driving the creatures back to the woods. I could hear snarls and chuffs and growls being exchanged, as though it was a language only they knew. Finally, the pack retreated, leaving us in an uneasy silence. The next morning, I found Paws sitting by the edge of the woods, staring into the trees. He looked back at me, his eyes sad but resolute. I knew what he was trying to tell me. "It's time for you to go, isn't it?" I whispered with tears streaming down my face. Paws licked my hand and nuzzled his head under my chin. He stood up on his hind legs one last time and howled, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the forest. Then with one last look at me, and I swear he grinned, he turned and disappeared into the woods. The next summer, visiting my grandma's house in Virginia, I couldn't help but think of Paws. One day, while exploring the woods near where I'd found him, I heard a familiar whimper. My heart skipped a beat and I followed the sound. There, in a small clearing, was Paul's old collar, and right next to it was a pile of blackberries. I smiled through my tears, knowing that Paws was still out there, watching over me with his golden eyes. As I looked around, I saw a shadow move a little deeper into the woods. I knew it was Paws, and even though we were apart, our bond remained unbroken. I want to thank you for staying to hear my story, and we've come to the part where I have to ask you to like, subscribe, comment, use the little bell for notification settings, that sort of thing. Those really help out the channel. I appreciate you so very much, and please feel free to share this with anybody who you think might like it. Until next time, be well, be happy, and stay safe. After all, it's a weird world.